This is a woman's life. This prime minister gave us the only recession in the G20, and he stands up and starts joking about her state of affairs. She's sleeping on someone's couch, Mr. Speaker. Will the prime minister stop being so flippant?
Mark Carney snaps at Pierre Poilievre in Parliament before doing something so shocking that Parliament erupted and things got so heated that the prime minister decided to stop answering questions altogether. And that was not even the biggest problem. The Liberals are once again being forced to cave to Donald Trump on multiple fronts. But the real story may be what is happening behind closed doors in the Liberal caucus, because Bombshell new reporting suggests that Liberal MPs are turning on Mark Carney. And oh boy, just wait until you see what was in that report. I'm Cantin-Nantel. Welcome back to the podcast. Before we get started, I do want to let you know that we include all the sources in the description because this is a fact-based podcast. Be sure you are subscribed if you're not already. Up to 90% of my viewers are not subscribed. It literally takes a second to subscribe and it's free to do so. Be sure to hype the video, like the video, hit the notification bell, and consider getting a paid channel membership for less than $5 a month because, my friends, I am one of the only journalists left in Canada that refuses to take the federal government subsidies. I will hold the line, and it shows.
Journalism commentary 1 year anniversary.
I don't believe journalism being funded by the government is the solution.
You have to rebuild the foundation. You have to retell the stories. Market conservative other news that actually matters.
I hence wanted to ask. I think they should answer their questions, especially if they're politically charged.
Part 1. Carney snaps at Poilievre. There is something that took place in question period that you need to see because it reveals something pretty damning about Mark Carney and who he really is. Now, I want to preface this by saying that I'm not actually a fan of question period. There's a reason why I don't frequently show clips from question period on this podcast, and it's because as someone who used to work on Parliament Hill, I started working on Parliament Hill when I was 17 years old. I was still in high school when I began working for MPs, and I realized right away that it feels more often than not that question period is about political theater rather than answering questions. But there are, once in a while, times where there are legitimate questions that are asked that demand legitimate answers, especially the types of questions that the parliamentary press gallery wouldn't dare to pose. And there are also times where the answers from the government can reveal a lot about either the state of affairs, where we're going, as well as who runs the country. And we had one of these moments that you need to see for yourself. So Pierre Poilievre asks Mark Carney about the fact that Canada is the only G7 country in a technical recession, which, regardless of what you think of Pierre Poilievre or Mark Carney, it is a fact that after a year of Mark Carney in power, after a year of elbows up, after a year of alienating the United States, after a year of maintaining policies like the 53% income tax rates that affect growth, after a year of maintaining high deficits, we are now in a technical recession, and that's not good. So Poilievre asked multiple questions about that, and what was interesting about the answers is Mark Carney sounded very defensive, almost angry, to the point where when I was first listening to the exchange, I thought to myself, man, he just snapped. Like, it just came off as angry and defensive. That's how I interpreted this, but have a look at it for yourself and let me know what you think.
What this government is doing is putting in place the foundations of an economy that will be stronger, more resilient, more independent. We are seeing, in the face of U.S. tariffs, in the face of global uncertainty, in the face of higher energy prices, we are seeing business investment accelerating. We are seeing wages growing twice the rate in the United States. We are seeing this country put in place the conditions for sustained prosperity. Mr. Speaker, I'll do a little research for the Leader of the Opposition. If you'd like to ask the C.D. Howe Institute, they know the answer to that question. If they'd like to ask the OECD, which today predicts that Canada will have the second strongest economy in the G7 this year and next. That is the answer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are in an economy that is fundamentally being transformed by a government that has a plan, to create a stronger, more independent, more resilient economy, a sustainable economy, an economy that moves from reliance to resilience. What I heard in New York is that Canada is the most attractive destination for foreign infrastructure investment. What I hear from major global investors who want to invest more than $100 billion in this country, what we are already seeing, which is foreign investment that's running in this country at twice the rate of any other G7 economy.
Pierre Poilievre then brought up the human impacts that this state of the economy is having on Canadians, which kudos to him, because I think a lot of times politics, we get into debates about issues, we forget that it is affecting real people. Real people are affected by policies, right? So he brought up the story of a woman in Toronto who lost her job and as a result is homeless. So watch the question and then watch how Mark Carney responded to it, because my goodness.
Zara from Toronto lost her administrative job at a real estate business. She can't find a new job and now has to sleep on a friend's couch. What's the Prime Minister going to tell her if he cares enough to stand up and answer? Is he going to tell her that she's just technically homeless and technically jobless?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to wish the Chief of the Opposition, Leader of the Opposition, a happy birthday. I hope his day improves. The government is focused on building a stronger economy. We recognize the scale of the challenges that this country is facing from abroad. We are focused on that administrator. We are focused on farmers in Battle River Crowfoot. We are focused on a future that is stronger, durable, more independent, more resilient, more sustainable.
As you just saw, Mark Carney laughed. He laughed.
The Chief of the Opposition.
You have the Prime Minister of Canada, a man worth millions of dollars, a man who flies on private jets, a man that spends six figures on catering for those private jet flights that include luxury buttercups, whatever that is, and fine bottles of wine, a man who wears $1,000 Italian Zegna boots while playing hockey, and he can't even answer a question about a homeless woman struggling without laughing. Laughing! This was a real life example of someone being negatively impacted by the economy after a decade of the Liberals in power. Mark Carney is laughing. Like, this is incredible. Pierre Poilievre was obviously stunned by this, and he addressed it in his follow-up question. And following that, Mark Carney did something even more shocking. Watch.
This is a woman's life. This Prime Minister gave us the only recession in the G20, and he stands up and starts joking about her state of affairs. She's sleeping on someone's couch, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister stop being so flippant about the suffering that he's caused in the lives of Canadians and tell Zara, is her homelessness and joblessness just a technicality?
The Honourable Minister of Jobs and Families.
Well, thanks, Mr. Speaker.
Where's the Prime Minister? You see, rather than answering that question, Carney had someone else answer the question. For the rest of question periods, his ministers, his handlers answered the questions. And you know what? Actions reveal a lot more than words. Part 2, Carney caves to Trump again. The Mark Carney Liberals caved to Donald Trump on multiple fronts. And look, what they caved to Trump on are things that I agree with. So I actually applaud the Prime Minister for doing these things. I'm not going to just dunk on that. But we still need to remind ourselves every time he gives in to pressure from the U.S., even if what the U.S. is asking is reasonable and good, we have to remind ourselves that that's not what he ran on. Remember, this guy's Mr. Elbows Up. I'm going to stand up to Trump. You can't trust Pierre Poilievre because Pierre Poilievre will cave. and I will be the elbows up guy. But that's not been the case. And that's okay, I guess, in a way. But it's also kind of dishonest because that's not what he ran on. And it shows that a lot of people in the last election were manipulated, were gaslit to electing a fourth Liberal term rather than a Conservative government. So the first thing he did is take action on the CRTC wanting to triple the tax on streamers, as reported by the National Post. The federal government will order its broadcasting and telecommunications regulator, which is the CRTC, to review its recent decision to triple the amount that online streamers must contribute to Canadian content while injecting $600 million to help the cultural sector. On Wednesday, Culture Minister Mark Miller confirmed the government disagrees with the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission's requirement to raise online streamers' contribution from 5 to 15% of their annual revenues. Here is Mark Miller talking about this.
We don't agree entirely with the CRTC's decision. I will be directing the CRTC to review that decision, and from now until then, we'll be actually assuming that role and making sure that people actually get the money they've been asking for.
The decision was praised by the United States Ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra. On X, Hoekstra said, quote, "Today's announcement to review the CRTC's online streaming tax decision is welcome. American firms want to invest in Canada's creative sector, and a fair, non-burdensome framework makes that possible." Conservative MP Rachel Thomas, meanwhile, had this to say.
After nearly 2 weeks of excuses and trying to mislead the Canadian public, the Liberals are now backpedaling and admitting that the Conservatives were in fact correct. The Liberals tried to mislead Canadians by claiming that it was out of their control. They could do nothing about it. Meanwhile, Conservatives continued to fight. Getting the CRTC to review its decision, however, is a good first step, but it is not the end, and it is not nearly enough. Let's not ignore the larger issue at hand, and that is this. The Liberals all too often put regulations in place which drive up the cost for the consumer. And then, because of that added financial burden, they offer a subsidy, which again results in another tax, having to take money from the consumer once again. And on it goes. And so until the government actually makes a decision to remove the regulatory burden to begin with, it will continue to impose that additional cost to Canadians.
There were others who weren't happy, particularly the Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet. Quote, "After abandoning the digital services tax, Ottawa is once again sacrificing funding for cultural creations by allowing web giants to avoid paying their fair share," he said. In addition to this CRTC decision, which will at the end of the day appease Donald Trump, Prime Minister Mark Carney also announced he will be tabling new legislation to combat forced labor after the Trump administration proposed new tariffs on a list of countries, including Canada, due to problems with forced labor. So, from Bloomberg in the Financial Post, the U.S. is proposing new tariffs of at least 10% on imports from 60 trading partners following an investigation into goods allegedly produced by forced labor as President Donald Trump seeks to rebuild the sweeping tariff wall struck down by the Supreme Court. The 10% rate would apply to imports from Canada, Mexico, the European Union, Taiwan, and the UK. Now, I should note that there are several goods exempted for Canada because of our free trade agreement, but it's still problematic. The Canadian press had a bit more information about the rationale behind the decision and the report in question. Here is what the Canadian press said. Quote, "A report from the Office of the United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer said that although Canada's imports prohibition came into effect nearly 6 years ago, the number of enforcement actions Canada has taken to prevent the entry of forced labor goods is minimal." It criticized the Canadian Border Services Agency, which is a CBSA, for not publishing statistics or information on its enforcement efforts and described Canada as a quote-unquote dumping ground for re-exports of forced labor products barred from the United States. Now, Canada has taken past actions on forced labor, but when Prime Minister Carney was asked about this is what he said.
The motivation of the U.S. action, the 301 tariffs against, or proposed tariffs against a variety of countries, is something that we share. Canada has a very strong legislative regime against forced labor in supply chains. We don't want any element of forced labor coming in goods and services, and we want to use our influence to eliminate this practice of forced labor and child labor. We have been preparing ways to reinforce the regime that we have. We made some changes earlier this year on things that candidly were not as effective, so there's ways we can change things legislatively. We'll be proposing that to the House in the coming weeks before the House rises, is our intention, and then taking steps to move forward on that. So, when you boil down the action, we support the overall objective, the U.S. action, I should say, and I would note that, in effect, how it's drafted for the vast majority of Canadian trade, it will not have an impact. But at the same time, since we support the overall objective, we have the objective and we're working towards making it more effective.
So Mark Carney said he'll take more actions on a matter, which ultimately is an admission that there is a problem. And look, again, this is a good move on Carney's behalf in the sense that there will be a benefit to Canadians in our relationship with the U.S. Forced labor is a bad thing. But again, he caved to Donald Trump. And that's just a fact, even if we think it's warranted here. And there's something else that's been exposed here. You'll recall the original reason for the first round of tariffs was regarding opioids and border security. Canada had issues with both. And while we had an open border, you had people that were flying into Canada and then illegally immigrating to the U.S. Now, in all fairness, you also had the reverse. But the opposite was also happening where people were flying to Canada to then smuggle into the United States. Illegal immigration from the northern border, which is the Canadian border, became a problem for America. And Canada began taking this issue very seriously once the tariffs were announced. They announced new border protection measures that weren't in place before. And then came around the digital services tax, which also became an irritant for the Trump administration. And Mark Carney decided to get rid of it. This was a tax that was going to tax businesses, but also ultimately affect Canadians negatively. And again, it took the Americans rather than the Canadians saying, maybe as we're trying to get more business into Canada, as we're trying to lower affordability, a new tax is not a good idea. No, it took pressure from the Americans. And this leads to my commentary on this story, which is Canada has to stop being reactive and be proactive, because we have a problem with being a reactive country. Again, here, we were reactive rather than proactive. The same thing just happened with the CRTC decision. It took days and negative reaction from the US before Canada took action. And now on the forced labor issue, before we take further action, we wait for there to be stories about new tariffs because of forced labor. Again, reactive, not proactive. In all of these scenarios, you clearly had issues that existed. Now, to what degree those issues existed has been subject to debate. There are other people who have claimed that Donald Trump will use any excuse to impose tariffs. And I mean, if you look at Liberation Day, the whole announcement was a gong show and they imposed tariffs on an island with penguins. And you look at Trump saying that he thinks tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary. I think you can have some credence to that. But when Canada has been hit with tariffs, there has been, as a citation, as a cause, an actual problem that the Canadians have then gone and tried to fix. That's a fact. I don't like the tariffs at all. But it's also a fact that the U.S. has cited issues with Canada when imposing these tariffs, and Canada has then gone on to fix these issues that should have been fixed a long time ago. And this leads again to this proactive versus reactive issue. Why are these issues not already being addressed? There are lots of problems in Canada, lots of underlying problems. Canada has not been suddenly fixed because Mark Carney is Prime Minister. Canada is still, in my personal opinion, a broken country. We have a lot of problems. That does not mean I'm unpatriotic. The opposite is true. I love this country. I want this country to be fixed. But we have fundamentally a lot of problems. Just go for a walk in your city's downtown and you'll see that things are not doing well. And yet we're not being proactive. Instead, we wait until the U.S. puts pressure and then we do something. And I think that when Canada has weaknesses and the politicians only take action when pressure is being put on them by a trading partner, that signals to the world a weakness. It sends a message to the world that we're willing to act once pressured. And that is not a position that I want to see my country be in, especially as we go into some big trade negotiations. So moving forward, the lesson to be learned here, regardless of if Trump wants to impose more tariffs or not, let's turn this challenge into an opportunity and let's start being proactive. And I think that once we become proactive, we will see great benefit. Part 3, Liberal MPs turn on Carney. The Toronto Star's Althea Raj has published a piece about what's going on behind closed doors in the Liberal caucus, and, well, it's pretty damning. But after reading the article, there's something else I observed on top of what's in it that I think many will have missed and I want to bring up and I think you should hear about. So first, let's have a quick read at the piece. It's by Althea Raj in the Toronto Star. Reading from the article, the Prime Minister has a penchant for centralizing power, one explored a few times in this column, and now the edict to his Liberal MPs is that he does not want to be challenged. Over the course of several caucus meetings, Grit MPs report Carney lashing out at certain members when he doesn't like the message they deliver. They include Nova Scotia MP Jamie Baptiste, a Mi'kmaq from Cape Breton, raising concerns over negative perceptions of the government's changes to the Indian Act and receiving a stunning rebuke. Winnipeg MP Doug Eyolfson, a physician, being told not to come to the Prime Minister with his concerns over the lack of federal response to Alberta's two-tiered healthcare bill, Bill 11, and Laval MP Angelo Lacono, who wanted the Prime Minister to visit his riding and was met with Carney insisting he'd been to Laval recently, though he had not. The experiences have left a lasting imprint on several MPs. He yells, said one MP, who, like others, spoke on the condition of anonymity. He punches down at caucus all the time. The article continues with one MP portraying how Carney talks to caucus as the following. If you don't agree with our agenda, I don't want to hear it. If you have criticism, keep them for yourself, was the way that the situation was portrayed. So amidst all of this happening, there are leaks coming out, including this particular story. And the solution from the Prime Minister seems to be, let's not maybe reflect and change course. You know, you're a team leader after all. No, the solution is to tell MPs to stop speaking to the media and stop emailing the Prime Minister. Again, from the article, quote, this week, Caucus Chair James Maloney told Liberal MPs not to talk to journalists. He also told them not to write to the Prime Minister with their concerns because their letters could leak. So there are two things I want to say about this story. First of all, as the Prime Minister, you're not the ruler of Canada. You're not the CEO. You're a servant of the people, by the people, for the people. And so is your caucus. It is your job to listen to them. These people, and look, I didn't vote Liberal, I probably never will, but the Liberal MPs were sent to Ottawa by their constituents, okay? People voted for them to represent them in Parliament. The House of Commons means House of Commoners. They are supposed to be people representing people. And when you have people representing people, you have concerns that get brought up. And that's the point of a caucus meeting. The caucus meeting, you know, there's often, and I've been to some, as a journalist, there's a little public part where there's a little speech. And then they tell the media to leave and they close the doors. And it's supposed to be a place where concerns can be raised in a private environment, but not under Mark Carney, I guess. And this kind of highlights an issue that I personally have with Carney, which is he doesn't really seem to be that fond of democracy. This individual got a majority through floor crossings. This individual is not fond of MPs bringing up their concerns in caucus. And also in that same article, it's been reported that Mark Carney is foregoing nominations, so basically internal party elections to pick candidates, which is the democratic way to pick candidates, in favor of appointments. That's not a good trend. That's not something that I like to read. And look, sometimes conservatives do things that are similar, and I don't like those either. I don't like when conservatives rig nominations or cancel nominations or kick nomination candidates out. I don't like when conservatives tell MPs they can't speak to the media, et cetera, et cetera. But here the Liberals are doing it. It's the Liberals that are doing it. And I think it's wrong. And I'm going to call it out. Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, is a democratic position, and you need to uphold your duty to be a servant of the people. And if that's not what you want to do, then there's probably a nice job at Brookfield that's waiting for you, okay? Now for the second thing that this story further confirms, and this is where something some may have missed, is it shows that there are cracks forming in the Liberal government, the Liberal caucus. When you look at the media coverage, we're kind of being told that everything's going very well. And in all fairness, there are certain things going well for Carney. The recession is not one of them. The lack of progress on the U.S. trade talks isn't one of them. But you look at the polls, there was a poll recently revealed Mark Carney now has 50% support in the popular votes, which is very, very high. And likely he would win a majority, super majority, if there was an election today. Now, we can have our different reasons for why that is. I personally think that a lot of Canadians are not getting a healthy, balanced news diet. They're only getting news from mainstream media, and that's having an impact. And I think this is problematic. I think also, the boomers are voting more than the young people, so Liberal turnout will be higher, but it's still just a fact that the Liberals are doing well in the polls. But beneath that, beneath the surface, behind closed doors, there are starting to be problems. Stephen Guilbeault, a high-profile MP, quit. You had reports of 14 Liberal MPs signing a letter to Mark Carney saying they're concerned about his agenda and where he's going. Now you have this report in the Toronto Star where MPs are turning on Carney. When you're willing to speak to the media in the way that those MPs were to Althea Raj, it's because they're frustrated. They're not being loyal because loyalty is a two-way streak and they don't feel that the Prime Minister is loyal to them, so they're turning on him. And the only reason why I think this hasn't gotten worse is because the polls are quite good. But the honeymoon won't last forever. Other Prime Ministers had poll numbers like this and they ended up either resigning or losing elections or losing their majorities. So eventually the polls are going to start to go down, especially if this technical recession continues, especially if the trade talks don't go well with the US. And we're looking at other stories in Canada too that could have negative impacts. And this signals the start of something not good. And if this continues, because I don't think this is going to be the last article, it shows that, Mark Carney may be in trouble. Now, I may be proven wrong. Maybe he'll end up being okay and win 3 terms like Trudeau. I mean, oh my gosh, I hope not. I'm not saying it's over for Carney, but I'm saying it's not looking good right now when you start to see these divisions. And this kind of goes back to my main thesis that ties all the 3 stories that we talked about together. When you look at Mark Carney, who raises his voice in question period before laughing in response to a question about a homeless woman, you look at Mark Carney waiting until the U.S. calls out Canada on an issue before taking action, and you read reports of Mark Carney yelling and snapping at his MPs. It leads me to these questions. Does this sound like a confident Prime Minister? Does this sound like someone with a credible plan to make things better? Does this sound like someone who cares about what he's doing? Is this someone you want running the country? I'll leave you guys to answer those questions, and I would love if you shared that in the comments down below. That is all the time we have for today, so thank you for watching. I know there's often a lot of bad news in this, but I think we have to remember that better is possible, and this won't last forever, just like Mark Carney's honeymoon. And let's keep up the good fight. Let's keep supporting independent media. Let's keep showing up when we need to show up. We are in control of our own destiny, and just remember that on days that may feel a bit demoralizing. So thanks for watching. Be sure you are subscribed, hype the video, comment your thoughts down below. Consider getting a paid channel membership if you feel like it. And until next time, God bless you and God bless Canada.